And we're back like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your chilly Saturday evening here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. The newest entry in our continuing series of the best movie you've never seen. And this is a film that is quite old. If my math is accurate, it is more than 90 years old. Is a big filmmaker, a legendary, iconic filmmaker for more reasons other than what might be obvious, and a really home run cast with some all-timers, including an actress who was very young here, who actually ended up in James Cameron's Titanic 65 years later. The filmmaker I'm talking about is none other than the man who brought us Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, among many others, and who was played by Sir Ian McKellen in the 1998 film Gods and Monsters. A lot of people had thought that Sir Ian should have won the Best Actor award that year. The filmmaker is James Whale. The movie is the Haunted House comedy horror film, which isn't really a haunted house movie, but we'll get to that. But the movie is The Old Dark House. What a perfect title. So I first watched The Old Dark House, not in the class that I took at New York University called the horror film, but I watched it in Hollywood and its alternatives. Same professor, I should point out, David Legowski, who I had had in fall 1994 for the horror film, and then the following semester for Hollywood and its alternatives, which is one of the 5 core classes back in the day, in the stone ages of the mid-1990s, for New York University Cinema Studies majors: silent screen, language of film, Hollywood and its alternatives, film now, and everybody's least favorite class, film theory. So I knew who James Whale was. I had seen Frankenstein and I had seen The Bride of Frankenstein. But when you were the sort of kid that I was, the sort of young person I was in the days before the internet or being able to Google information at the touch of a button, literally, I knew who James Whale was, but I didn't know that James Whale had a very particular history and that many of the people he worked with had very particular history. And so these are things I know now. And you can watch the movie from a different slant, a different angle, when you understand that, okay, this is working on more than one level because, for example, this actor is gay. This actor is also gay. The filmmaker is gay. And then you start, it's like with Rock Hudson, where there were so many movies in his career when you learned that Rock Hudson was gay. Okay, he's playing straight, but there are kind of windows into his thinking, and then you can drive yourself crazy trying to, well, what was Rock thinking when he shot this scene? James Whale was a trailblazer. He was a pioneer. He was a fantastic filmmaker. And the fact that he was able to advance as far as he did in a business that, I mean, Hollywood is crazy, right? And people talk about, that there's too much, or, there's too much inclusion, woke this, woke that, whatever the case might be. But the fact that James Whale was able to have the career that he did, it's pretty amazing. He was just super talented. He was a fantastic filmmaker. We're talking early sound period. He mastered the form before just about anyone else. You might argue before anyone else, because his buddy Todd Browning, who did the original Dracula with Lugosi right around the same time, they may have been shot concurrently. That I'm not sure, because I think they're both 1931. But when James Whale was making Frankenstein, and Todd Browning was making Dracula, Todd Browning, he didn't really know how to utilize sound. I know it sounds, no pun intended, that's almost absurd, but he did not use sound as effectively as he could have in that movie. And he shot it in a weird way where there's important stuff that takes place off screen when you're watching. That's the thing with the original Dracula, unlike Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, which are both fantastic films. I love Bela Lugosi. And Dracula is an important film. You want to compare it to the Nosferatu of 2024, the Robert Eggers, excuse me. the movie as a whole is a little bit of a letdown, because after a fantastic first 15 or 20 minutes, it's kind of not that interesting after that. But James Whale was really something. And The Old Dark House, there are certain stereotypical elements in movies that we see today, but then you hearken back to when the prototypes were made, were formed, were engineered, were seen by an eager viewing public. This is not a haunted house film. It takes the form of a haunted house film. This is a dark and stormy mansion, 10 Little Indians type of story, without really being a 10 Little Indians type of story, meaning like not everybody getting bumped off in the manner of that, or in the the movie Clue from the 80s. It's the same kind of a setup. A bunch of strangers who might not actually be strangers end up in this mansion when it's pouring rain. They come in out of the rain, et cetera, et cetera. So The Old Dark House has some of the great actors of the era. And in the case of Boris Karloff, who plays kind of an interesting role as sort of a hulking brute named Morgan, Boris Karloff literally worked for almost another 4 decades. What an incredible, and he played Frankenstein, or I should say Frankenstein's monster. Colin Clive actually plays Frankenstein. That's one of those things when Frankenstein is not really the name of the monster. It's the name of the doctor, and the monster is Frankenstein's monster. It's just almost a little bit of a semantics thing. But you have Boris Karloff. You had a guy who was an enormous star in Charles Lawton, another enormous star in Melvin Douglas, a phenomenal supporting actor named Ernest Thieziger, who was part of the group. He played Dr. Pretorius in Bride of Frankenstein, and he and James Whale, I don't know about James Whale's personal life other than that he was gay, and I think he was out of the closet even for the era. See, these are things that now would be reported, but back then, you look at reporting from the 70s, the 80s, even into the 90s, it didn't necessarily go into this. So I don't know if James Whale and Ernest Thieziger, I don't know if they socialized. I don't know that. But Ernest Thieziger had a very particular performance style, which there are kinds of roles that you say, wow, that guy is amazing. He's fantastic as Dr. Pretorius in Bride of Frankenstein. In this movie, he kind of plays a butler, a bit of a manservant, I guess, and he's incredible. His character is kind of a comic relief type of a character. The actress that I referenced and didn't name, who was in Titanic, her name was Gloria Stewart. Gloria Stewart made it to 100. She passed in 2010. She was born in 1910. She plays Old Rose in Titanic. She was about 86 when her scenes were shot. Knowing that you've seen Titanic and you go ahead and, I hate to put it this way, the strength of my recommendation that you'll enjoy this film immensely, you fire it up. It's free on Tubi. That's one of the free apps. Gloria Stewart was 21 when The Old Dark House was shot. She was junior in college age when this movie, you wouldn't be able to recognize her. No way. But it's her. 64 years before she shot her scenes in Titanic. And it was one of the reasons when it was a big deal when Gloria Stewart made this kind of comeback. And The Old Dark House was a film that people were talking about. Oh, I saw that in film school, like me puffing out my chest in 97 when I said, oh, wait a minute, I know who that is. I saw that movie. Woo. So you have this dark and stormy night. You have this remote mansion. You have travelers who are stranded because it's raining so much. Like all of these elements, they hadn't been done before, at least not in movies, because how could you do it? And now they would become genre fixtures. They would become archetypal elements. Somebody had to do it first. And that somebody was James Whale. And so Ernest Thieziger, as the kind of butler, I don't know if he specifically is called a butler, but he is presented as basically a miser. Even though it's not his house, it's not his money, but he is presented in a very miserly way. And he's so particular in the way he reads his lines that he's pretty funny. And Professor Legowski, he didn't kind of warn us that, oh, by the way, the guy that you saw in Bride of Frankenstein, for those who have seen it, he's pretty much comic relief in this film. It's okay to laugh. We didn't know, because there are certain movies where we would be laughing and it's like, I don't know that we're necessarily supposed to be finding this funny. But Ernest Thieziger, he's such a miser, and it's like it's pulling teeth to get him to even offer food to these hungry, scared, soaking wet travelers. So somebody comes in, another person comes in, another person comes in, and you have this kind of motley crew with Charles Laughton and Melvyn Douglas and Gloria Stewart. And they're sharing a meal. They got a ton of food. There's only like 4 people, and now you have these kind of travelers out of nowhere just sort of dropped in. And Ernest Thieziger, rather than simply asking, would you like a little bit of beef? Would you like a little bit of rice? He very imperiously goes, have a potato. Have a potato. He should have won Best Supporting Actor Oscar just for the different inflections he puts on the line reading of have a potato. Yes, I should love a potato. And then we hear about a family member that is, we got to stay away from whoever he is. He's dangerous. And so there's this big buildup of this other character that's somewhere in the house, and we just keep him locked up, or whatever the mechanics of it are. It's something along those lines. So we keep waiting. We keep waiting for ghosts to show up. We keep waiting because it feels like this is a haunted house story. But it's more a story of a very eccentric family in some cases, but a very eccentric group of people who happen to be in this old dark house. I mean, the title, you want to talk about nail meat head. It's a very old and dingy house. The lights are flickering because, it's 90 some years ago, but also this is a pretty serious storm. And if we can still lose power in 2024 when there's 40-mile-per-hour winds, think about 1932. Like, this is pretty accurate. And the movie is set at that time. Characters have cars. It's pretty much what you would expect from the haunted house genre. But it's not really much of a spoiler. It doesn't go in that direction. This is not a supernatural story. This is a story of a little bit of cabin fever. Jack Nicholson in The Shining. I would argue that he's batshit crazy when he first gets to the Overlook Hotel. But it's supposed to be that the cabin fever makes him even crazier. Here you have these very eccentric people who may or may not actually be dastardly, evil villain types. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Maybe there is more going on with this kind of mysterious other character. Maybe he is a prisoner in this house because these eccentric people are the ones who are crazy. We don't know. And it's to the movie's credit that there are a lot of mysterious elements while the movie is making us laugh. And this is something that's not easy to do, whether it was back then, whether it's now. To balance edge of your seat kind of horror elements with kind of gentle, whimsical humor. But Whale is able to do it beautifully. And the balance, the way he figured out, how did they know how to edit the sound as well as they did? Because if you watch this movie, if you don't know that the coming of sound had just happened within the previous 3 or 4 or 5 years, that most filmmakers were still trying to figure out exactly how to optimize the 1932 era camera and using microphones to record, monaural, whatever words you want to use. James Whale somehow already had it figured out. The quality of the sound in this movie is better than almost any other film of the era. And if you, again, listen to the sound in Frankenstein, the sound mix there is very, very good, whether or not the print of the film, because you could find some really shitty prints on the internet. And if you go on YouTube, that there's a lot of degraded copies. Bride of Frankenstein, 3 years later, after The Old Dark House, sound quality is just incredible. So there are just some people who weren't simply, they didn't just know where to tell the actors to stand or how to deliver the lines, or they find the film in in the editing room. There were some filmmakers that were just great at everything. And James Whale was one of those people. So I mentioned the movie Gods and Monsters, that Ian McKellen and Brendan Fraser was still on the rise. He hadn't even made the first Mummy. His career had really ascended through the 90s, as many of you know. The James Whale we see in that movie, I don't know if that really is how he was, but he came across as, he didn't really come across that well. It was a sort of warts and all biographical film, because it's more about, James Whale. But I feel like that there were certain things that were kind of mixed up. And I don't believe that the real James Whale was the way that McKellen, and I love McKellen's performance. This has nothing to do with it. And the movie is terrific. But based on things that I read and other people and what I learned at NYU, don't think that James Whale was the way that he was presented. I feel like he lived his life quieter and was not as, I don't know what the word, not forceful, but he was more aggressive in the movie than what I was led to believe he was in real life. The way that McKellen played him, he just played him in a very sort of swashbuckling manner. And, as a movie, if you know nothing of James Whale, it's a 3.5, maybe a 4-star movie. It's really well done. Performances are great. And there is an idea that that the real James Whale was starting to kind of lose it a little bit. And there were some incredible scenes where he's almost having flashbacks or memories of moments from his career. And it's sort of, you're not really sure, is this just a thought? Is he losing his mind? Some really interesting directorial choices, in that film. The Old Dark House, though, is a short movie. I want to say that it's maybe 80 minutes. I'm confident it's not as long as even 90 minutes. It doesn't necessarily feel like a short or shorter movie because a lot of stuff happens. And there are almost no wasted moments or wasted shots. And even as there are these kind of scary beats, the next laugh is always there. Anytime Ernest Thieziger is on screen, you almost can't help but laugh because of his performance style is kind of broad. And sometimes a broad performance style will backfire, but he was so good at what he did that it doesn't. And we start to look forward to seeing his character as much as possible because he's just so damned entertaining. I don't really think that either Charles Laughton or Melvyn Douglas, who had just unbelievable careers, and Charles Laughton even showed promise to be an incredible filmmaker. He directed Night of the Hunter, a famous film with Lillian Gish and Robert Mitchum in an almost purely villainous role. Mitchum was just a great actor. He looked like, he kind of looked like a heavy, so to speak. But Laughton only made that one movie, and it's kind of a little bit of a missed opportunity from a historical perspective that he didn't go further with his directorial career. But he was an actor as kind of a jolly, like a bigger guy. People compared him to John Candy. He wasn't as big as John Candy, and he was not as, he had it in him to be comedic, but they didn't have the same skill sets. But that's when John Candy came on the scene, a lot of people said he kind of reminds a little bit with the shape of the face of Charles Laughton. And Melvyn Douglas, here's a little bit of trivia for it, because he was still working well into the 1970s. He had a really long and prosperous and incredible career. The actress Illeana Douglas is actually his granddaughter. I don't think it's his great-granddaughter. I think that she is his granddaughter. So, she's kind of a little bit of Hollywood royalty, and sometimes you see that. The Barrymore family. Drew Barrymore, her great-grandfather was John Barrymore. He was one of the most famous actors of the silent era. So, I don't know nepotism. It's just what it is. Some people are just supposed to be in that business, right? When I first saw The Old Dark House, though, I loved it. And even though the film was 60-some years old when I first watched it, which would have been 95, it was probably even before Gloria Stewart had been cast in Titanic. That's how long ago it was. Now almost 30 years. That semester began in January of 1995. It's fucking crazy. But my sense was everybody in the auditorium, we saw it in the Schimmel Auditorium, it's the Stern School of Business, when they had the big film classes, that had too much enrollment, they wouldn't hold the classes in the cinema studies department, which at the time was the 6th floor at 721 Broadway, just School of the Arts. But they would hold it in what was at the time known as the Schimmel Auditorium in the Stern School of Business. My sense was everybody enjoyed that movie. And I can't say that about too many films we watched that semester. We saw some films that almost put me to sleep. Heaven forbid that I admit that even someone like me who was there from the educational perspective, I was there to learn, there were movies that were incredibly boring. You know, Pierre Le Faux, the Francois Truffaut film, I think it was Truffaut. I don't think that was Godard. To get those two guys confused is pathetic, but I'm pretty sure it was Truffaut. But Pierre Le Faux with Jean-Paul Belmondo and I think Anna Karina, after 10 minutes, I was going blank. No, thank you. I'm all set here. Marcel Ophuls, the Lola Montez, that one almost put me to sleep. The Old Dark House had me from beginning to end, even though I didn't know, because Legowski, he didn't tell us what I said about, oh, this is a haunted house story without the haunted house. It's just a big old dark house. But I loved it. And I never saw it aired. Okay, this is not a movie that would be on, it could have been on public television or something like that, but I don't remember ever seeing it on TV. And a couple of years ago, I was just sort of curious and I looked and I said, son of a bitch. And at the time, the movie was actually free with Amazon Prime. Now, because of the way that my brain works, I wanted to make sure, because, for example, there are movies such as Charade. There are great films like Charade, which are in the public domain. And you can find prints of these films which are so degraded, it's not even worth watching the movie. And I'm not joking when I say that. So when I saw that it was on Amazon Prime, I checked and the print was okay. But oddly enough, the print that was on Tubi was a cleaner print. So this is a kind of film. And yeah, I understand the movie's 90 years old. It's not going to look like Barbie, but there is a difference. And there are certain prints of older films that are so degraded, it's almost not even worth watching. You have to kind of hunt around and look, because the movie Charade, there's like literally 5 different versions of it on Amazon Prime, and 4 of them are shit. And one of them has a print that was restored and cleaned up, and that's what is streaming. So The Old Dark House, which is streaming free on Tubi, it is a very high quality print. The sound mix is good. The effects work. Obviously, there's not really that much in the way of effects work, but for example, the rain looks real. The thunder and lightning, like this movie was made with care. It was made with love by a master filmmaker. And when I think of kind of the second tier greats, I mentioned Henry King on the William K. Everson podcast. Ruben Mamoulian is another guy who was just an extraordinary talent. But James Whale, for that era, because he worked in the silent period and then with the coming of sound, he made 3 absolute masterpiece films in a 4-year period. I mean, that's almost Alfred Hitchcock making North by Northwest, Psycho, and The Birds at Vertigo first. Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, and The Birds. Well, James Whale did Frankenstein, The Old Dark House, and The Bride of Frankenstein between 1931 and 1935. Historically speaking, he didn't have to take a backseat to anybody, because all 3 of those movies, he just knocked it out of the park. Yeah, you could say he had great stories to work with, but there was a way to make Bride of Frankenstein, and it wouldn't have been nearly as effective. His sense of timing and his pacing. Just compare the way that Todd Browning, even the pacing of the original Dracula, it's just not quite there. It's like you wonder if something happened during production, because the first like 15 to 20 minutes of Browning's Dracula are unbelievable. And it just doesn't feel like the same movie after that, as incredible as Lugosi is and was. Bela was the man. Didn't really speak English. He had to do it phonetically, but that's a whole other, what are you going to do? But The Old Dark House, I'm pretty confident if you're under the age of 40, you haven't seen this movie. I'm going to go on record and say that, because it's the sort of thing you would have to have looked for. And we tend to think that old horror movies are just not very scary. And that movie, I wouldn't necessarily call it scary. It's just an enormously fun, ride from start to finish with a slam bang cast and one of the master filmmakers at the helm, just crushing it, knocking it out of the park in the late, great James Whale. The Old Dark House from 1932, the newest, most recent entry in our continuing series of the best movie you've never seen. This has been episode 399 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Saturday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.